I pranked Pushy Salesmen with a crank caller's number. I've been working in the field for a company that generously provides me with a company phone. I've had this phone for about 3 years now, and it's been quite the experience. The phone's number was issued through Verizon Wireless, and apparently it used to belong to someone named Jeter Watts. I've invented the name to protect privacy, but let's just say it's been a persistent issue. From the moment I took over this number, I started getting an overwhelming number of sales calls, somewhere between 8 to 10 times a day. The constant barrage of calls was relentless and incredibly frustrating. I've tried every possible solution to stop these calls. I've explained to countless callers that this is a company phone, and I've even identified my company to them. I registered the number on the Do Not Call list, thinking that this would solve the problem. But nothing seemed to work. Despite my best efforts, the calls just kept coming. The pushy salespeople never seemed to believe that I wasn't Jeter Watts. They would argue or insist that I must be him, no matter how clearly I explained the situation. To make matters worse, there's an additional complication. When I call someone, the caller ID still shows up as Jeter Watts. It's a bizarre glitch, and neither my company's IT department nor Verizon has been able to fix it. It's become a bit of a running joke at the various locations I service. People often laugh and say things like, "Oh look, Jeter Watts is here," or "Jeter Watts is calling again." It's been an ongoing joke for 3 years now, and while it's amusing, it doesn't make dealing with the constant calls any easier. One day, while I was at one of my service locations, I encountered a different kind of problem. A customer from this location had been making crank calls. This guy had a disturbing habit of saying sexually inappropriate things whenever a female answered the phone. It was a recurring issue, happening several times a day. The location had managed to capture the caller's number because, initially, the guy hadn't bothered with caller ID blocking. When I learned about this situation, an idea immediately came to mind. I decided that I could turn this problem to my advantage. Since the crank caller's number was already known to the location, I thought of a plan to deal with the incessant pushy salespeople who kept calling for Jeter Watts. My idea was simple but potentially effective. I would take the crank caller's number and give it to the pushy salespeople, telling them that this was now Jeter Watts' new number. It was a bit of a mischievous scheme, but at that point, I was willing to try anything to stop the incessant sales calls. So, for the past 2 months, I've been implementing this plan. Whenever a pushy salesperson calls asking for Jeter Watts, I engage with them as if I were Jeter. I tell them that this is my new number, and then I give them the crank caller's number, asking them to save it and call me back at this new number. I also emphasize that this is my direct line now and that they should make a note of it. To my delight, this scheme has proven to be quite effective. The frequency of the pushy sales calls has significantly decreased. Instead of receiving 8 to 10 calls a day, I now only get 3 to 4 calls per week. It's been a considerable improvement, and it seems that my plan has worked. The crank caller is now receiving a steady stream of sales calls, and I no longer have to deal with the relentless pushy salespeople. One of the unexpected benefits of this situation is that it has brought some humor to my day. Whenever I'm at a service location, people still joke about Jeter Watts and how he's apparently been busy with all these sales calls. It's become a running gag among my colleagues and the people I work with. They laugh about how Jeter Watts is getting his just desserts from the crank caller's number, and it's made the whole situation a bit more bearable. Looking ahead, I'm curious to see how this situation will evolve. I plan to revisit the service location next month and check if the crank caller's calls have reduced as well. If the crank caller's number has been inundated with sales calls to the point where they're no longer making inappropriate calls, then my plan will have achieved its full effect. It will be interesting to see if my scheme has not only reduced the sales calls for me but also had a positive impact on the crank caller's behavior. In the meantime, my daily work routine has become much easier to manage. The reduction in sales calls has made a significant difference in my productivity and peace of mind. I no longer dread answering my phone or dealing with the relentless salespeople who would call multiple times a day. The change has been refreshing, and I feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that I've managed to outsmart the pushy salespeople with a bit of creativity. It's also worth noting that while this solution was born out of a somewhat frustrating situation, it has provided me with a unique story to share. The tale of how I used a crank caller's number to reduce my sales calls has become a bit of a legend among my colleagues and friends. It's a testament to how sometimes thinking outside the box and turning a problem into an opportunity can lead to unexpected and amusing results. Overall, this experience has taught me a valuable lesson about persistence and ingenuity. Sometimes, when faced with a persistent problem, it's important to keep trying different solutions until something works. In my case, a little bit of mischief and creativity managed to make a significant difference in my daily work life. It's a reminder that even in the face of frustrating challenges, there's always room for a clever solution and a bit of humor. I'm looking forward to seeing how things play out in the coming months and whether the crank caller's situation improves. If my plan continues to work as intended, it will be a satisfying end to a long-standing issue. In the meantime, I'll continue to enjoy the peace and quiet from the reduction in sales calls and keep the story of Jeter Watts and the crank caller's number as a funny anecdote to share with others.